How should we vote in the upcoming election in just a couple of days as evangelical Christians? Yesterday, we just celebrated the 503rd anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther on All Saints' Eve or Hallows' Eve nailed the 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg, Germany, in protest to the doctrinal defections of the church from what the scriptures truly taught, and especially as it related to the true gospel of God. Well, since that time, it has sometimes been brought up, kind of tongue-in-cheek, somewhat jovially, that evangelical Christians, Protestants, don't always know when to stop protesting. Normally, I object to that accusation because it's so often in the context of those who are trying to contend earnestly for the faith, who are fighting the good fight, who are trying to persuade men to be careful and sound in their theology, to refute those who contradict, in order that their congregations might not be tossed to and fro and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness and deceitful scheming, but speaking the truth in love, encouraging their congregations to grow up into all things, into Him who is the head, even Jesus Christ. However, we have been hearing a whole lot of talk about making a protest vote in this election against Trump, our only real viable nominee option for Christians, because we very clearly cannot vote, embrace, stand for in any way the Democratic Party platform. That's obvious to all of us, or at least it should be. But the question becomes, well, President Trump, he's not exactly, well, let's say a moral candidate that I would want for the office of the President of the United States. And so I think it's better for me to make a protest vote. Do a write-in. John Piper, in his recent article, has caused a lot of confusion to that end. His article wasn't especially helpful. I don't think it was biblical either. I have respect for John Piper, but I don't think his article was helpful. I don't think it was timely. What Piper and what many others have tried to do is dissuade evangelicals from what really amounts to a relevant vote. And the argumentation, I believe, is unnecessarily binding the conscience of believers into believing that it would be wrong for them to cast a vote for Trump. I want to help you with that. That's what I want to discuss in this video. I've also seen a lot of pastors kind of try to, well, maybe play a little softball here. Follow your own conscience. If your conscience says you can vote for Trump, you need to vote for Trump. But your conscience, if it says you can't vote for Trump, well then don't vote for Trump. Well, I will affirm with Martin Luther also when he said in 1521 at the Diet of Worms that it is dangerous to violate your conscience. But I also want to encourage you to make sure that your conscience is biblically informed, because we need to think about what the conscience actually is before we start saying things like, your conscience can say that you can vote for Trump, and my conscience can say, no, I cannot. Again, because of what the conscience actually does when it's carefully and biblically defined. Now, we know that the conscience is a gift from God. Romans chapter 2, verse 15. It is a gift from God for good. It informs us of what is right and what is wrong. But we also know at the same time that the conscience can be seared. Romans 1 talks about that when we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And also 1 Timothy 4:12, I believe it is, Paul also argues there that we can sear our own conscience. We can dull it, so it no longer instructs us that, well, this activity over here is evil. It is a violation against the law of God. But also our conscience can be wrong. It can be misinformed. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 14, and especially verse 5. He says we need to follow our conscience because violating our conscience would be a matter of sin, even if the action itself is not. So, to summarize what he said there once again, if I believe something is sin, because my conscience tells me it's sin, even if it's not sin, if I go and participate in that activity, it's still sin because I violated my conscience. It was a heart issue that was rebellious against the law of God, even if I was wrong. So Paul addresses that misinformed conscience, meat sacrificed to idols in Romans chapter 14. But the conscience can also instruct us in doing evil. Hebrews 10 verse 22 tells us that the conscience can actually encourage evil. And it can as well even be defiled. Paul talks about that in the book of Titus. So then, let's take a look at, is it really a matter of conscience whether or not we vote for Trump in this upcoming election? I don't think so. Because if we look at the conscience, what it is, biblically defined, carefully defined, as it was intended by God, it is intended to tell us, instruct us in what is morally right and what is morally wrong, what is sin and what is righteous. And so to posture this discussion as a matter of, well, you just need to follow your own conscience, I think is a result of postmodernism. Now, some say we live in a postmodern society today. Really, I think what we're seeing is a hardened postmodernism. Your conscience is your conscience, and you need to follow your conscience. My conscience is my conscience, and I need to follow my conscience. That's essentially become code word for saying your truth is your truth, and you need to follow your truth. My truth is my truth, and I need to follow my truth. Well, that's not what the conscience does. Again, the conscience tells us what is a violation of the law of God, which means that if you truly believe this is a matter of conscience, you must say, my conscience says I cannot vote for Trump. And then you must also likewise say, I earnestly believe that you voting for Trump is sin. To my knowledge, no evangelical anywhere is arguing that. In fact, even John Piper admitted that he does not believe it's sinful for anyone to vote for Trump, and except he was still arguing why his conscience was bound against voting for Trump. And like I said, I think unnecessarily binds the conscience of many other believers because of an ideological piety that ultimately results in a separatistic, passive approach to how we live in a fallen world. It is the same kind of ideological piety, the separatism of the Mennonite movement and the Amish movement. Because I am presented with two imperfect options, it is better for me to be inactive here, or to cast a vote that is essentially inactive or irrelevant, to move the results of the election one way or another. So if this is not really a matter of conscience, what is it? That's where I would go to 1 Corinthians chapters 8, 9, and 10. It is a matter of Christian liberty. You have the liberty as a Christian to vote for Trump. And you have the liberty as a Christian not to vote for Trump by either not voting at all or voting a write-in protest vote, something to that effect. I don't think that's appropriate. And my reason is because of the right use of Christian liberty in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. When we think about whether or not I have the liberty to do something or not do something as a Christian, what governs our use of liberty? Well, it is either the fact that my use of liberty will lead another one who earnestly believes, or conscience believes, that a certain matter would be sinful. They earnestly believe that that would be sin, and so you lead them into actual sinful behavior. Or it is not what is loving your neighbor. Your use of liberty, well, what governs it should be governed by, or should be instructed by, what is most loving to your neighbor. Before we do anything, if we want to live all of life to the glory of God, we should evaluate what is most loving to our neighbor. That's true of this election. Before you use your Christian liberty not to vote for Trump or to write in a protest vote, decide for yourself what is most loving for my neighbor. In Romans chapter 13, Obviously, God says the role of the government is to restrain evil. Trump's campaign has earnestly done that. They have worked hard, actually, to restrain evil, even if we still have real objections, as a matter of conviction, to moral failures of our president. But at the same time, when using your liberty to protest against Trump, what is most loving to your neighbor? Well, police unions across America really believe they know what is most loving to your neighbor. Pro-life groups across America really believe what is most loving to your neighbor would be to vote for Trump. That's why they've endorsed Trump in this election, because the alternative is catastrophic to your neighbors, including your neighbors who are unborn, including your neighbors who might be subject to, well, a lack of law enforcement, to chaos, to disorder. It would be unloving to those even around the world, as, believe it or not, Trump's policies have brought a tremendous amount of stability and peace in some unprecedented ways around the world. So, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is one who is especially familiar with a very similar context, he was remiss by Baptists especially, who, well, took a passive approach to the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. They preferred to just allow him his way, and they regretted that decision. But by the time they regretted that decision, they realized it was already too late. There was nothing they could do. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer warned the German Christians, silence in the face of evil is itself evil, and God will not hold us guiltless. Not to act is to act. Well, I would argue that an irrelevant vote is effectual inaction. And also consider another thing that Dietrich Bonhoeffer said: the true test of any moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. I really earnestly believe that should govern how we vote as Christians, and whether or not we're going to do a protest vote against Trump or vote for Trump. What kind of world will our use of liberty leave for our children? You have questions about that? Just look at the Biden campaign and what it has promised to do in its first 100 days versus Trump's track record in the nomination of federal judges all the way up to the Supreme Court, and how much those protect our life as Americans, but most importantly, our religious freedoms. Take care. God bless. I hope that was helpful.